I was reminded of this by an upcoming storm, and I figured I should share this story. This takes place about 4 years ago, right at the beginning of the biggest snowstorm of my life. It was February, and in my home state of Massachusetts, we're no strangers to snow. At this point, there was already a good foot of snow on the ground from previous storms. Right before the storm started, I figured I should dig up some of the snow that had been collected in the chicken run. It was early morning, and as I was getting ready to go out, I noticed that the motion sensor light had gone off next to the chicken coop. I looked around the yard from my window and didn't see anything. As I went to the door, my cat Alfred got in front of the door and was looking at me. He was a strictly indoor cat, so it wasn't like he was asking to go outside. I gently moved him aside with my foot, but he got right back in front of the door. He usually wasn't like this, so I thought it was strange. I figured he wanted attention, so I picked him up and sat him on a chair. I went outside onto my back deck. Now, my yard is pretty narrow. Maybe 30 foot by 200 strip of grass, and a garden that has been slowly being taken over by the forest behind my house. At the end of my yard, there was a steep hill covered in trees that led up to the rest of the forest. The chicken run was about 10 feet from the deck, so I went over and got to work, letting them out for a bit and feeding them before starting to shovel. When I was about halfway done, one of my chickens, a Rhode Island Red, started squawking. I've heard these chickens squawk before, but my two buff chickens always did this before they laid an egg. Yet, this was more of an alarm call, and I hadn't heard this type of noise since my dad's dog tried to attack them. I was outside the run, dumping a bucket of snow into a pile. I looked up at the chickens. They were all along the back of the fence of the run, looking at something on the hill. I looked at the top of the hill, and what I saw still gives me chills to this day. There was a big black dog-like thing sitting at the top of the hill, staring down at me. I froze looking back at it. I knew the animals in my area, and the only two possibilities that would make sense for this to be is a fisher cat or maybe a coyote, but they were both too small to possibly be this. We stared at each other for a few minutes, its yellow eyes glowing in the early morning light before it stood up on its hind legs and turned and ran into the forest. I ran back into my house, slamming the door shut and locking it. I still don't know what that thing is, but I'm reminded of it whenever the motion sensor lights go off or my neighbor's dogs start barking. I hope to never see it again. The following is a story my grandfather used to tell me before he passed away. I'm no World War II buff, and I'm just retelling this story the way I remember hearing it, so I apologize if some dates and locations may be slightly off. My grandpa was a British infantryman in the Second World War. He was only about 19 years old when he enlisted to serve his country. And while he thought that joining the military would give him opportunities to see exotic locations around the world, he was never deployed anywhere he really wanted to go. Instead, he ended up practically in his own backyard, Switzerland. This is just some historical information, but it's important to understand before reading the rest of this story. Switzerland did its best to maintain neutral status throughout the war, but regardless of its attempts to maintain neutrality, Switzerland was still highly sought after by both the Allied and the Axis powers. Once the Nazis began committing acts of aggression against Switzerland, England provided reinforcements to the Swiss military. Yet in an effort to prevent open war within its borders, the Swiss government instructed its military and the British reinforcements to perform a series of tactical retreats into the Alps. That's how my grandpa found himself stationed in a remote village in the Swiss Alps. At this time, it was early in the winter of 1943, and my grandpa's company was stationed in a secluded village of about 500 people. Part of the advantage they had that with this location it was really hard to get to and therefore had little chance of being spontaneously invaded by Nazi Germany. But this was also a disadvantage because it made communication with the rest of the Swiss military very difficult. The issue with communication was further compounded when sometime in early December, a series of blizzards swept through the region and completely destroyed the few lines of communication they had in the first place. So essentially, trapped in this isolated Swiss village without being able to make contact with the rest of the army, my grandfather's captain decided it would be best to uphold the standing orders and continue defending the village. Weeks passed, and any roads to the outside were buried in 7 to 9 feet of dense snowfall, and any telegraph phone lines that they had were equally useless. It grew deeper into winter. The leaves were stripped from the trees, and the bare trunks protruded from the mountainside like broken ribs. The town was nestled between two large mountains. Sunlight only directly reached the town for a few hours each day, making the soldiers feel as if they were living in a state of perpetual dusk. One night, my grandpa was at the town bar with a few of his friends from the company, and a group of locals approached them. One of them in particular was visibly upset. All of the Swiss people in the town grew up speaking German, and none of them were used to having Brits around, so one of them began speaking in broken English. "Where take you the children?" Luckily, one of the guys my grandpa was drinking with spoke pretty fluent German and was able to act as an impromptu translator. After several minutes of confusion and yelling, the translator turned to my grandpa and the rest of the soldiers and said, "They say some of the village children have gone missing and they want us to do something about it." Now obviously, the British military doesn't exactly act as a bunch of mercenaries for hire, so my grandpa and his friends told the villagers to come back to the headquarters, which was really just a makeshift barracks they had thrown together in the town's church, to talk to the captain. Due to the language barrier, the villagers' discussion with the captain took about 2 hours, and basically what the captain and his self-designated translator was able to piece together was that a few weeks after the company entered the village, the locals had noticed a variety of bizarre incidents. At first, it was just benign stuff like vanishing pieces of wood and tarps from people's sheds. But over the following 2 months, people realized that valuable items were being stolen from their homes. One man claimed that his family heirloom, a handmade ceremonial halberd, sort of like a traditional Swiss war axe, had disappeared from above his fireplace mantle. The culmination of all these incidents was when a village child went missing. Of course, many assumed that the child's disappearance, although tragic and disconcerting, could be attributed to something as simple as the boy falling into a snowdrift while playing outside, or possibly being attacked and killed by a wolf or other predatory animal. But there wasn't only one child that disappeared. There were several. The villager who entered the bar who had looked especially upset, that was the father of 2 young boys who had gone missing 2 days beforehand. He had searched everywhere for them. He even rounded up a posse of his fellow townspeople to join the effort, but they couldn't find a single clue as to what had happened to the children. The captain told the villagers that he would continue to look into the matter and that he would begin sending some of his men to patrol the streets each night, looking for whoever, or whatever, was the culprit behind all the strange thefts and abductions. Later that same night, Private Reginald disappeared from the barracks. Disappearing children was one thing, but a grown man? It seemed unlikely that an animal, even a wolf, could have taken down a healthy, full-grown man on his own. Naturally, rumors began to surface that there was some sort of monster living in the mountains that came down at night to feast on the occupants of the village. Despite the nightly patrols ordered by the captain, the disappearances kept occurring. Reginald was the only adult victim of whatever was preying on the village. The rest of the victims were all young kids between the ages of 5 and 10. All in all, including the original 3 kids who had gone missing, 7 children vanished from the town. Many people in my grandpa's company were growing suspicious. One explanation that they got passed around was that impoverished villagers were actually selling their own children to human traffickers for extra cash, but even that didn't make sense because the roads into and out of town were still blocked by the snow. 3 more weeks passed without incident. At this point, it was early spring and the snow was starting to thaw. That night, coincidentally, when my grandpa was on patrol with several other soldiers, they discovered what was behind the children and Reginald's disappearances. It was sometime past midnight when my grandpa and his comrades noticed a figure peering through the bedroom window of one of the villagers' homes. My grandpa was at the opposite end of the street, so at first the figure looking through the window didn't see the patrol. My grandpa and the other soldiers yelled at the prowler, and it immediately tore itself away from the window and began running away. Everyone in the patrol was certain that this was what was behind the disappearances and break-ins. They ran as fast as they could in pursuit through the melting snow and ice in the dead of night, screaming at whatever it was to stop. They kept running and soon found themselves on the outskirts of the village, where the snow was still fairly deep. The figure jumped into the ground. It looked like it had just vanished into thin air at first, but as the patrol grew closer, they realized that the prowler had actually just jumped into a cave that had been hollowed out inside of a snowdrift. Just as the soldiers began yelling into the cave for the figure to come out and show itself, several gunshots exploded out of the entrance to the snow cave. Without thinking, my grandpa and the rest of the patrol shouldered the weapons and all began firing into the hole. Afterwards, there was silence. They waited for what seemed like hours, but was really just a couple of minutes. One incredibly brave member of the patrol volunteered to climb into the cave and investigate. He drew his pistol, kneeled down, and crawled into the cave. Several seconds later, he emerged, with a completely horrified expression on his face. My grandpa took out his flashlight and shined it into the cave when he saw the gruesome explanation behind the strange occurrences in town. The figure that they had been chasing was Reginald, the private who had gone missing weeks before, and they had shot him right through the heart. The cave was not only occupied by Reginald, though, but also the bodies of 7 partially eaten children. Either due to the stress of being snowed in all winter, living in near constant darkness, or maybe some sort of terrible mental issue, Reginald had gone completely insane and had begun breaking into villagers' houses and snatching their children from their homes in the middle of the night. He had used the halberd that he had reported missing to dismember the bodies. After he cut the children and slit their throats, he hid them into the cave carved into the snowdrift. This happened when I was 9 years old, but I still remember it as though it happened yesterday, if you can pardon the overused cliche. It was the middle of January, and we were having the worst snowstorm recorded where I lived. Needless to say, all of the schools in the district were closed. Around noon, I went out to simultaneously celebrate the rare snow day and revel in the snow with the other kids who lived on my block. We all trekked down to the nearby playground. I suppose it was because there was more unsullied snow there. At one point, the group decided to try and build an igloo, but I quickly lost interest as it was not holding together, and I was tired of being bossed around, so I separated from the group to a fresh patch of snow several yards away. I was going to make a snowman. I had just finished the first ball and was already bored and thinking about rejoining the group when I looked at the snowman again. I saw that there was an older boy standing near it with a grin on his face. I noticed that there was something a little strange about him. His clothing seemed old-fashioned and somewhat ragged, but I didn't mention anything. In fact, we never really said a word to each other, but by the end of the afternoon we had finished our snowman. I took off my hat and put it on the snowman's head, and the boy unwound his thick woolen scarf from around his neck to place it on the snowman. When he finished, he smiled at me, bent to kiss my cheek. I remember that his lips were cold, but that didn't seem weird to me at first. After all, we had just spent all afternoon playing in the snow. He gave a little wave and turned around to walk away. One of my friends called my name and I turned to look. They had all given up on their igloo and were heading back home, so I followed and didn't give another thought to the strange boy until later. Over a mug of hot chocolate, one of my friends commented on how quickly I'd managed to build the snowman. I laughed and told her that it wasn't that hard since I'd had help. A strange, uncomfortable silence fell over the group, and one of the other girls said they hadn't seen me with anyone. I rolled my eyes, figuring they'd formed some sort of collective pact to freak me out or something, sort of a way to get back at me. But I let it drop. The next day, I went back to the park where we'd been playing. Most of the area was covered in footprints and evidence of my friend's attempts at that igloo. But as I approached my snowman, the footprints thinned out. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were no footprints there at all, whatsoever. Not mine, and not the boys. The snowman stood alone, surrounded by white snow, untouched except for the tracks where we'd been building the snowball bases. It's so weird. I stood there for a moment, looking around in case the boy was standing nearby. No one was. The snowman still wore my hat. I went over to it and retrieved it. After a moment's thought, I went back and unwrapped the scarf from around the snowman's neck to place it around my own. I still have that scarf, and to this day I wear it during the winter or whenever I'm feeling lonely. Hey everybody. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. I'll have another video coming real soon.